Psalm 29, verses 3 and 4, and then 10 and 11. The voice of the Lord is over the waters. The God of glory thunders. The Lord over many waters. The voice of the Lord is powerful. The voice of the Lord is full of majesty. Down to verse 10. The Lord sits enthroned over the flood. The Lord sits enthroned as king forever. May the Lord give strength to his people. May the Lord bless his people with peace. Psalm 65, verses 5 to 8. By awesome deeds you answer us with righteousness, O God of our salvation, the hope of all the ends of the earth and of the farthest seas, the one who by his strength established the mountains, being girded with might, who stills the roaring seas, the roaring of their waves, the tumult of the peoples, so that those who dwell at the ends of the earth are in awe at your signs. You make the going out of the morning and the evening to shout for joy. Psalm 93, verses 1 to 4. The Lord reigns. He is robed in majesty. The Lord is robed. He has put on strength as his belt. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved. Your throne is established from of old, you are from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their roaring. Mightier than the thunders of many waters, mightier than the waves of the sea, the Lord on high is mighty. Psalm 107, verses 23 to 30. Some went down to the sea in ships, doing business on the great waters. They saw the deeds of the Lord, his wondrous works in the deep. For he commanded and raised the stormy wind, which lifted up the waves of the sea. They mounted up to heaven. They went down to the depths. Their courage melted away in their evil plight. They reeled and staggered like drunken men and were at their wits' end. Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. God and God alone has created the seas and the oceans. God and God alone controls the water and the weather. God and God alone reigns as king over nature. God and God alone brings and ends natural disasters. And this is what John wants us to know in our passage this morning. Just as only God can create something out of nothing to supernaturally provide bread for his people to eat, so only God can do what Jesus does in our passage this morning. If you remember from last week, Jesus feeds 5,000 men. It's probably closer to 20,000 people total, including women and children. And then they want to take him by force and make him their king, a political military king, so that they can overthrow the Roman oppressors and so they can have their freedom as a people. They don't believe that he is the Messiah. They don't believe that he is the Son of Man sent by God to bring about the kingdom of God. They follow him because of his signs and miracles. Look at what he does. We want to see more of that. We want more of that. And they don't have the love of God in their hearts, which is why they don't believe him. And because they reject him, they reject also the one who sent him, God the Father. So Jesus withdraws from them to a mountain, presumably to pray. Maybe he's with just the 12. Maybe initially it's just him. But he withdraws to a mountain to pray, to be with the Father, to refocus, to prepare for what's next. And from there, our passage begins this morning. So back to John 6, starting in verse 16. When evening came, his disciples went down to the sea, got into a boat, and started across the sea to Capernaum. It was now dark, and Jesus had not yet come to them. So presumably Jesus sends the 12. They probably just don't come up with the idea on their own to travel over to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. So he sends them down to the boat to travel by boat, and they get on the boat on the sea. And the sea has kind of deep biblical symbolism. The sea is symbolic biblically for danger or death or evil. Even the Psalms that we read just a moment ago, when David describes what it means to be overcome by evil, the cords of the sea wrapped around me, they entangled me. The whole idea of Job being tossed into the sea and his engagement with God when he's in the belly of the great fish. We see in the scriptures that the sea is a symbol of darkness and danger and evil. And in this dangerous state and on these dangerous waters, Jesus is what? Not with them. He's not with them. At least not his physical body is not with them. And so this heightens the intensity. So here they are, alone, without Jesus, on a boat, in a sea that we'll find out in a bit, historically is known for having rather violent storms. And the sea is a symbol of that. Oh, and it's also dark. Nighttime. Darkness also has symbolism, even in this gospel, of evil, being in the darkness, danger, under the cover of night. So here are the disciples on a boat, on the sea, which has a certain symbolism about it, in the dark, which has a symbolism about it, and there's no Jesus. So the intensity of the situation is heightened for them. And John wants us to feel in these verses the ominous situation. The 12 of them get on a boat in the sea, and it's dark, and Jesus isn't with them. Verse 18. The sea became rough because a strong wind was blowing. Now, this area around the Sea of Galilee is a much lower elevation. And so what would happen, or what continues to happen obviously, is that you have cool air kind of rushing down the mountains into the sea, and as it mixes in with the warm air that comes up from the sea, this is what causes the violent waves. And so there's a very natural explanation for what happens even to this day in this area of the Sea of Galilee, the mixing of the cool air and the warm air and the elevation, and so the winds and the waves. But this is not a coincidence. So we don't look at this and say, man, God really timed that well. I mean, he really lucked out. No, this is not a coincidence. As we've seen in this gospel over and over again, this is by divine design. Them being sent to the boat alone at night on the sea, and then the sea becoming rough and a storm just so happens to hit them as they're on the boat and there's no Jesus in sight. This is by design. This is divine appointment. God is doing this, and he's doing this for a reason. Verse 19. When they had rowed about 3 or 4 miles, they saw Jesus walking on the sea and coming near the boat, and they were frightened. So they rowed about 3 or 4 miles, which is about halfway across the Sea of Galilee. So they're in the midpoint of the sea. They're halfway across, and they see someone, a figure that looks like a man, coming toward them on the water. Now, we need to keep something in mind. When we think of this story, or even if we imagine the way it's been portrayed in certain movies, we imagine they're on a boat, and then Jesus is just kind of walking on the water. We were just told there's a storm going on, which means the waves are rising up and down, the wind is blowing, and so this figure who's walking on the water is not walking on calm, flat water. This figure is striding across waves that grow and then sink, and so they look at the figure, and as the water would rise, he's walking up the wave, coming down the wave, like he is walking across stormy waters that should be flipping him apart. And so this is why they're terrified. It's one thing to see someone on the water and the wave rises and he sinks, but he rises with the waves. The wind blows and it doesn't push him aside. And so they see a figure, and we know from Matthew and Mark that they think it's a ghost. And they become frightened. Now, John's not so concerned with telling us what they thought, just knowing that they're terrified at a figure that looks like a man who is walking over and on top of these waves that are thrashing about, that's making them threatened in the midst of the storm. Now, of course, they're afraid. Also, we know that Jesus wasn't walking slowly. How do we know that? Well, they were 4 miles out. And so the idea here, even in the Greek, is that he's striding along the waters. Like he's moving fast along stormy waters to catch up to them who are already 3 miles out. And so, yeah, they're completely terrified of what they see. They see a fast-moving man on the water as the waves are crashing about, coming towards them, right? He's gaining on them. This is what they see. And they're terrified. Understandably so, they're terrified. When we try to imagine the actual situation in the boat with them, this man-like figure gaining on them, walking on water as waves should be throwing him around, and he's just traveling on them without difficulty. Verse 20. But he said to them, "It is I. Do not be afraid." Jesus is now close enough so that they hear him. And remember, it's not still and quiet. So it's not like Jesus says to them, "Hey guys, don't worry." He's probably having to yell to them to get over the sound of the winds and the waves that are thrashing about. But he's close enough that even if he's raising his voice, they can hear him. And they see that it looks like Jesus, but I'm sure they still kind of doubt what's going on. I'm sure it maybe looks like Jesus. Is it an apparition? Is it a ghost, a spirit that's making it look like this Jesus that we know? And then Jesus says to them, "Don't be afraid. It's me. It is I." Or in the Greek, ego eimi. I am. That's what Jesus says. I am. Don't be afraid. Yes, the divine name. Now, ego eimi is a very common way to say, "It's me." Or, "Who are you?" "It's me." And so it's not as if this is a completely foreign phrase or greeting to introduce oneself. But again, Jesus will use this phrase periodically in the Gospel of John to communicate something about himself. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the good shepherd. Before Abraham was, I am. And so it's not just Jesus using a common self-designation in speech. Yes, he is using the divine name in order to communicate who he is. So how do they respond to this revelation of Jesus? How do they respond to this figure who's been gaining on them on the waves, and now he's close enough that they see him and they can hear him, and he says, "Don't be afraid. It's me. I am." Verse 21. Then they were glad to take him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. So they take him into the boat, and they're glad to do so, that it is in fact Jesus, that it's not a ghost, but it is the Messiah, it is the Son of Man. It is God in the flesh, showing power over the water, walking on it, in essence commanding it, showing that he can do only what God does. There is no man who can do this. No mere man can do this. Only God can do what Jesus has just done. And it appears that once he gets in the boat, we assume the storm has died down. More evidence that he controls nature by his will. And what's even more, and this is something that can easily be glossed over, when it says, and immediately they were at their destination. So we might think, well, they were pretty close already. And then he shows up and they realize, oh, we've been close all along. Except for the fact that John told us that they were 3 or 4 miles in. And so they were at the halfway point between where they departed and where they were supposed to land. And then Jesus shows up, gets in the boat, and then they're there. So Jesus fast travels them 3 or 4 miles from the middle of the Sea of Galilee all the way to the end. Again, something that only God can do. This is even more of a picture of power and deity being ascribed to Jesus. And Jesus was right. Jesus was right in John chapter 5 that his works bear witness about who he is. And so he strides along the water during the storm, gets into the boat. It seems the storm would calm down, and then they're instantly 3 miles or 4 miles beyond where they should be. And then they're at the other end at Capernaum.